It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Spring 2024 Ambassador Dave and Kay Phillips Family International Lecture presented by the Duke Program in American Grand Strategy as part of the Duke Centennial. I am Provost Alec Gallimore. The program in American Grand Strategy is a signature initiative here at Duke dedicated to understanding U.S. foreign policy and national security broadly conceived. The program's mission is to train the next generation of strategists by studying previous generations and interacting with current leaders. Each year, the program is proud to support the Ambassador Dave and Kay Phillips Family International Lecture, made possible by the generosity of the Phillips family. The Phillips Lectures are among the highest profile events at Duke every year and have brought a range of prominent figures in international security, foreign policy, and diplomacy to our campus to discuss issues of international importance. Tonight's event is a wonderful expression of this goal, with a special Duke connection to mark Duke's centennial. We are fortunate to have not one, but two distinguished guests with us this evening. They both embody the value we place on civil discourse here at Duke, on being a place where serious people from diverse perspectives can engage critically and respectfully on the issues of the day. David M. Rubenstein is co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms. Established in 1987, Carlyle now manages $426 billion from 28 offices from around the world. A magna cum laude graduate of Duke, Mr. Rubenstein has served as chairman of the university's Board of Trustees. Fareed Zakaria is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a best-selling author. His most recent book, An Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present, came out last week with W.W. Norton. He also has a Duke connection. He was the commencement speaker in 2012, and he also was the Phillips speaker in 2009. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by our very own Professor Peter Feaver, a professor of political science and public policy at Duke University, and the director of the program in American Grand Strategy. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Provost. It is a rare privilege to be on the stage with two of America's finest interviewers, and I get to be the interviewer and make them the interviewees. We know they're great on this side of the microphone. Let's see how they are on the other side. I thought I'd begin with a question. Do either of you have anything interesting to say about Major League Baseball? Fareed, do you have anything that you could offer on that, or David, maybe?
Well, it's a great American sport, and I think that anybody has a chance to go visit the Baltimore Orioles at Camden Yards. But it shows you the price of inflation, how inflation is affecting baseball teams. When the Baltimore Orioles moved from St. Louis in 1954 to Baltimore, the price was $2.2 million. The most recent price was $1.7 billion. I don't know whether that trajectory will continue, but hopefully it will. But baseball is a part of American tradition, obviously, and it used to be called the American pastime. Obviously, other sports are also very, very popular now. But more people go to baseball games, Major League Baseball games every year than NFL football games, though obviously it's because there's so many games. But it's still a sport that attracts an enormous amount of fan loyalty of the type I just was not used to. There are people who have gone to, I've met with them recently, who've been to every Orioles game, home game, for 40 years in a row. I mean, can you imagine what else they're not doing? And you know, there's a person I grew up with who's gone to, I think, every Orioles game for the last 35 years, and he keeps score in every game. I mean, I don't know what you do with these scorecards, but it's a sport that I think you know, it's one that I think captures the American spirit in many ways, and you know, we'll see what I can do. I mean, the truth is the team is very good, and so if things go bad, there's only one person going to blame, the owner.
Well, I notice you're wearing a Orioles tie. I'm not sure that's visible there. Those colors don't go with every suit ensemble. Are you going to have to change your wardrobe to?
I have different ties for every suit I have, so different.
You're a polymath, of course. You've made your mark across many, many domains. Professional sports is not one of them. So I will say I was surprised. I don't think of you as a baseball guy. I don't think of you as a professional sports guy. So connect the dot for me.
Well, I mean, let me explain. I was an all-star shortstop when I was 8 years old.
I missed that in the bio, my mistake.
Jewish Little League, and I thought all Jewish Little League All-Stars would become Sandy Koufax, and I'd get to the major leagues. Didn't work out. I would say that I've spent a lot of my recent years trying to promote the idea of giving back to the country. And in many ways, I thought I would try to do that in this way, in this sense. Baltimore, I didn't have any parents who were wealthy. I needed a public education. I had no real money for scholarships or things like that. To come here, I got a scholarship to Duke. But I grew up and got a good public education in Baltimore. And I thought I would like to give back to the city that made it possible for me to get to Duke. And so this was an opportunity that came along, and I thought I've tried to give back to the country. I'd like to give back to the city that I was raised in, educated in, my parents were raised in, educated in, my parents are buried in, and I will, in time, be buried as well. So I thought, you know, it'd be a good opportunity to give back to the city, and hopefully, you know, the results will be okay for the town.
We'll see. We're going to bring you back next year and talk about the record. But you're both well-known as writers as well, and both have written important books. Fareed, most recently, this book, which I commend to you all. The title is smaller than the author's name, Fareed. I don't know if that means anything. But it's well blurbed. I asked Walter to blurb my book, and he said, I'll either blurb your book or read it, but I won't do both. And so, but it's a wonderful blurb, but it's also a deep read. I gave it the DC read, I'm not in it, you're not in it. But everything else from the last 600 years is. So I thought we'd begin with this and also ask your...
For people here, what he was referring to, a DC read means that in DC, people only read the index to see if their name is in the book. And I guess my name's not in the book, so you gave it, and your name's not in there either.
No.
Okay.
So
My favorite version of that is a friend of mine wrote a book that in some way or the other he knew would be of interest to kind of the DC in circle. And the then editor-in-chief of the New Republic was a man named Martin Peretz. And he gives Marty Peretz a copy of the book. And Marty Peretz turns immediately to P. Peretz, Martin, and not only is there a page number, but the author has inscribed it there saying, "Hi, Marty, Mike Kinsley."
So, Fareed, give us the elevator pitch version of the book. It's enormous, the title, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. I imagine your agent was ecstatic when you described that title. But it is a deep book, so what's the argument?
It's a deep book, but very readable and accessible. So it's a beach read as deep books go. The elevator pitch is, let me start with something that David touches on in his next book, which I'm very eager to read, which is an examination of all the living presidents except one, I notice. So to start with the puzzle, why do you have the situation right now where President Biden has among the lowest, I think it's the second lowest approval rating of any president in American history, when the economy is doing so well? Historically, the single most powerful predictor of a president's approval ratings were people's sentiments about the economy. So for a while, people thought this was happening because while the economy was actually doing quite well, consumer sentiment was not maybe because of inflation, maybe there was a time lag, maybe it was some weird post-COVID effect. But for the last 2 years, consumer sentiment has been going way up because the economy is doing very well. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. Inflation is now down to 3.2%. And if you compare us to the rest of the world, it's absolutely clear that we have come out of both COVID and the 2008 recession better than any major economy in the world. The most interesting statistic I've noticed is inequality has been declining now for 4 or 5 years because wages at the bottom are rising faster than wages at the top. And yet, Biden's approval rating is stuck. And this break between economic indicators and a president's political approval rating is actually not new. It began with Obama. The stock market triples under Barack Obama. We come out of the Great Recession slowly but steadily and climbing. Does nothing to his approval ratings. In fact, you remember the Tea Party and the kind of fury that produces. Trump also presided pre-COVID over a very strong economy, very bad approval ratings, never really got better. And then you had the extraordinary event in 2016 when people's views of the economy flipped depending on the political party they were in. So the Democrats, who had thought the economy was doing great in December of 2015, by January of 2016, with a 30-point drop, thought the economy was now terrible because Donald Trump was president. And Republicans thought the opposite. And the flip happens again in 2020. In other words, your views of the economy are now determined by your politics rather than the other way around. So trying to make sense of all of this, what I argue in the book is that we are going through a period of great backlash against 30 years of 30 or 40 years of extraordinarily fast-moving progress, globalization, technological innovation, information revolution, these identity revolutions that have taken place over the last 30 or 40 years. And the backlash is largely cultural, that what is making people uneasy and making them sort of feel like they were in a world out of control is this sense of cultural drift, change, revolution. And as a result, economics is no longer a particularly good predictor of your political views. It used to be that the single easiest way to predict somebody's political views was what kind of job did they have and how much money did they make. If you were a blue-collar worker and you didn't make, you made kind of close to the median income, you voted Democratic. If you were a white-collar voter and you made more than that, you tended to vote Republican. Today, the single strongest predictors of how you will vote tend to be a cluster of issues that one could call the 3 Gs: gays, God, and guns. And those are much more powerful predictors than economics. And what I do is I try to go back in the book 400 years to the previous periods of massive revolutionary change in economics, technology, culture, and show how in each case you have a certain series of characteristics that happen, a certain backlash, and then you succeed or fail in the end depending on how well you navigate that backlash.
So the book is remarkably pro-Western liberalism, what is a view of the international order that is out of fashion on campuses, but also even in the political parties. But you're defending it and saying that if properly understood, the last 400 years produced some good. I want to push you on that to make that case and then ask David to comment on that.
So yes, you're right. I'm basically unabashedly in favor, if one has to describe it in these kind of crude terms, of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the world it unleashed. And the simplest way I can explain this is there's a graph in the book. There are not a lot of graphs. In fact, I think this is the only one. It shows you per capita income, average income for human beings over the last 2,000 years. And the line basically starts at about $400 per capita GDP, inflation adjusted in 2,000 years ago. And it goes straight, flat lines for 1,750 years. No improvement in human progress, standards of living whatsoever. And then you have that cluster of events that take place first in Northern Europe, then spread to the rest of Europe and the United States, which is the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution, and the graph becomes a hockey stick. It goes like this. And that represents the extraordinary achievement of the Enlightenment, which is the ability for human beings to start to think, to reason, to apply that reason to their day-to-day lives, to lift themselves out of grinding, miserable poverty. And yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of, it's a big conversation. Lots of things happen, not all of them good. It also produces imperialism and colonialism, which, I don't need lectures on as a guy who grew up in India. It also produces an enormous amount of pollution in the world because you have industrial progress, which is, the Industrial Revolution is largely an energy revolution. But at the end of the day, if you have to choose between living on $400 a year or $40,000, $50,000, which is roughly what the median income in the United States is now, it feels to me like, it's laughable to think there's a choice. And maybe it's because I grew up in India and my dad was a politician in a rural area. And so I went into India a lot, this is in the 60s and 70s, into rural areas of India where people lived under what are still medieval poverty conditions, right? This is India just 30 years ago. And to watch people move themselves out is a magical process. It's an extraordinary, the sense of pride and accomplishment and dignity that it gives human life, not to be ravaged by poverty and disease every day, is an extraordinary achievement. And so, yeah, I celebrate it unabashedly.
So my question for you, David, is do you agree? I'm guessing you do agree. Then the follow-up question would be, why is that view out of fashion? Why? That used to be the conventional wisdom, even called the Washington Consensus, if you will, and it's no longer in fashion almost anywhere. So help us understand
The U.S. economy became the biggest economy in the world in roughly 1870, and from that point on, we became not only the biggest economy, but the leading military, geopolitical, technological, cultural force in the world, which was seen by the world for the first time in a visible way when Woodrow Wilson went to Paris after World War I, and he goes into Paris and he's treated like Julius Caesar returning to Rome. He's, hundreds of thousands of people coming out cheering an American president in a way that we've never seen before. And from that moment on to now, the United States has been the dominant economic, military, cultural, technological power in the world, and with almost no exceptions or nobody competing with us. Now, the rest of the world has caught up in terms of technology, caught up in many other areas, and as a result, people who live under different regimes and different cultures and different governments don't think that necessarily what we built in the United States is so wonderful. And we all see our own problems on January 6th and other kinds of things. If you're sitting in China, or you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, you say, is that what I really want to live for? A government like the United States or a country like the United States, which had the January 6th kind of events? So many people say the United States, while it has some great features, is not exactly the paragon of virtue that we all thought it was 50 years ago or 75 years ago. So the world has changed a bit. And remember, as Fareed points out in his book, when Richard Nixon went to China, China was a relatively poor country. I think the GDP was roughly the same as India's. And then China became a cultural force and a military force and a geopolitical force that we could not have envisioned when Richard Nixon first went there. So now the world is not, just controlled by the United States, which it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were the only dominant country in the world. I think you called it unipower in the book. It now is competing with other cultures, other government forms, and if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, where there's a family that you could say has really built the country, and they're having a very nice lifestyle, why do you say the United States democracy is so wonderful? Or if you're sitting in Singapore, also an incredible place, but it's a democracy, but not quite the same as we have in the United States. Those people there are living a very happy life. They say, why do we necessarily want the values of the United States, where you have all the the confusion and fighting and a lack of bipartisanship. It's a different world than when we experienced it when we were growing up here, when I was growing up here.
Let me just add to what David was saying. So, one of the challenges we face in this new world, as I say in the book, is, it's not that America is being supplanted by China. We're not going from an American century to a Chinese century. America is still very, very powerful. The U.S. is still 25% of global GDP, which is the same, by the way, it was in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. But what has happened is what you were describing, David, which I describe in an earlier book of mine as the rise of the rest. The West rose for 300 years, and now you have the rise of the rest. Everyone has been growing. Everyone has been, learning from the best practices. The Abu Dhabis, the Dubais, the Singapores, the Indias, the Turkeys, the Indonesias. And so what you have is a world in which it's a lot of these middle powers who are much more unwilling to simply take directions from Washington. We know how to handle the Chinas and Russias of the world. The geopolitical challenge we have faced before. We understand what to do. The tricky one is, how do you deal with the Indias of the world, the Brazils of the world, the Indonesias of the world, the Turkeys of the world, who no longer are willing to play the role. Like Turkey is the perfect example. It used to be just a simple, stalwart ally of the U.S., did whatever it was told. And it now is, a powerful, middle-sized economy, very politically powerful, run by a very charismatic leader, and routinely tells the United States it will not do what Washington asks, which would have been heresy 20 years ago. And that's this new world of competing powers that of uppity middle countries and great and middle powers.
There's nothing in the Constitution or any other document that says the United States has to be the most important country in the world forever. If you go back through civilizations, even past what Fareed writes about in his book, no one country dominated the world for 200, 300, 400 years in a way that many people here think we're entitled to do. We had, I'd say, last century was certainly the American century. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But how many people here are 100% convinced that the end of this century will be known as the American century? It may not be. And, when I was
Talk to me on November 8th. Talk to me on November 8th, and I'll answer that, how fast that'll last.
When I was growing up, people would say, we want to die for our country. People are prepared to die for your country. And Americans did. We've lost millions of men and women dying for our country in military wars. But you think about it today, many people have observed the rest of the world in many ways. How many people here are going to say, I'd rather live in the United States and die for this country rather than move to Switzerland? I mean, you can have a nice life in Switzerland or a nice life in Singapore. And now we're exposed to how other countries live, and some of them have very nice lifestyles. The happiest people in the world are not people who live in the United States. If you look at the recent indexes, they're in Finland, Denmark, other places, and those people are very happy not living in the United States. So we have a great country, but remember, other people have some great countries and great features as well, and we just have to recognize we're not the dominant power in every respect that we once were.
So you both gave great answers as to why these views are not universally endorsed in other countries. Let me ask you, why are they out of fashion here in the United States? And you mentioned Switzerland, so that allows me to ask about Davos. One of the reasons is that the values you're describing got attributed to Davos man and separated from the American nationalist self-image in an odd way. That separation is not legitimate, as you show in the book, but nevertheless it took hold. So talk to this, the populist backlash against elites here in the United States.
Let me just take a stab at this initially. In 1960, when John Kennedy was elected President of the United States, the country was 90% white, 8% black, and 2% everything else. And if you were white, you're pretty happy. You're feeling that country is yours, and you are really in control of your country. Today, this country is in our lifetime will not be a majority white country. And so, if you're a white person who does not have a college education or doesn't have a very good job, you see globalization, in your view, taking jobs away from you. You see cultural forces that are helping minorities or other people you don't really like as much taking power away from you, or you think your job's away from you. There's been a backlash against the kind of things we've seen in our society since 1960 or so, and as a result, many people feel disenfranchised and they have less power. Their children are going to be less likely to get to the top of the totem pole than people who are minorities, who they don't, in many cases, feel are as entitled to the top of this country as they are. And so there's been a recognition, I think, by Donald Trump and others that there are a lot of people out there who feel, hey, we've been left behind, the world is leaving us behind, and our country isn't really doing what we want to help ourselves. They're helping the elites in New York, the elites in Los Angeles, the people who have fancy college degrees from Yale or Duke or places like that. And these people have been captured in a way by Donald Trump in a way that I don't think many other politicians thought could be done.
Well, I mean, David put it wonderfully. It sort of, in large part, informs the thesis of my book. I wish I had known that statistic of 1960. I would have used it in the book. The way I think of it is, it's three powerful sources of change that are leaving people alienated. Technology. It used to be that you made things with your hands and that you could feel enormous sense of dignity from that work. You didn't need a college degree, and you could raise a middle-class family doing that, steel worker, auto workers. We live in an information age where the information revolution means if you manipulate words, numbers, computer code, symbols, information flows of any kind, if you are a symbolic analyst manipulating these symbols, you do very well. If you're working with your hands, not so much. Machines do that, software does that, and that divide has become one that leaves a lot of people without those special skills feeling not just that they don't have as good jobs, but a kind of sense of loss of dignity. The second is these globalization changes that David mentioned, which is absolutely part of this idea, the explosion that has taken place of the ability for companies to go anywhere in the world. It turns out economically that's a smaller source of joblessness than the first one, but it's still something people feel. But the third, and I think David put it so well, is this sense that the world around you is changing. Because these other two ones are sort of abstract, So what you can put your fingers on is the fact that the guy who's moved next to you doesn't look like you, doesn't speak English with the same accent you do, maybe worships different gods. So America was about 4% foreign-born in 1974. It is now about 15% foreign-born. We've had a transformation. We've had the rise of this extraordinary rise of Hispanics in the country. You see, more importantly, I think, perhaps even more importantly than that, the biggest social change we have experienced in our lifetimes has been the emancipation of women. The reason I say this is because every society, some group has been on top, some group has been on the bottom for thousands and thousands of years. But the one group that was always second-class citizens in every society was women, until about 30 or 40 years ago. So, and the role of women is central to our conception of family and the basic unit of the social structure of our society, and we kind of upended it, or we changed it very substantially. So you do all this change in 40 years. It's hardly that surprising that you have a backlash. And into that backlash step people like Trump, who say, don't worry, I'm going to take you back to when America was great, before all this happened. The most important word on that cap is again. Make America great again. I'm going to take you back before all these forces that we were talking about happened.
In the United States, the word revolution is a word that people seem to like because we like the American Revolutionary War, because we saw that as a revolution, we changed. And politicians, if they want to get elected, they'll say, I'm going to Washington to be a change agent. I'm going to change things. I'm going to have a revolution in Washington. People love that, except when you actually live through a revolution. There's a Chinese curse, and it says, may you be condemned to live in a time of transition. Why is that? because when transition occurs, it's not that pleasant until you're done the transition. So everybody wants to live in a world where things are getting better, there's a revolution, we're changing things, but when you live through it, it's not so pleasant. And many people who are disaffected now feel they're living through a revolution where their power is being taken away from them, and they don't like it, and they think it's going offshore, or it's going to people in the United States who are elites on the East and West Coast, and they don't like that.
Your book points to two holes, and I want to talk about what might fill those holes. The first hole is a hole of meaning, and I was struck by how little you talked about religion in the first chunk of the book, and how much you refer to it in the last chunk of the book. And so, speak to that. Where are you going with that?
It's a wise observation, Peter, because in some ways, I don't think we realize the degree to which religion is sort of part of the air we breathe, in terms of the formation of the modern world, and the degree to which religion played a very powerful role in making people feel a sense of rootedness, stability, and even, if I may put it this way, a sense of acceptance of the complications of life. If something bad happened, you said, well, the ways of God are wondrous to behold, and he works his ways in mysterious ways. So you in a sense accepted that change, that revolution, because you had some deeper moorings, some deeper anchors. And one of the things that the 20th century and 21st century has done is it has eroded a number of those anchors. And this is one of the things, I think, that the Enlightenment project does, because it introduces reason and doubt and skepticism and individualism and individual autonomy into societies. And that has the effect of eroding these anchors. But what I think we didn't realize is how much people still need that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose, that sense of dignity. And when you start to lose it, you search for something to fill its place. There's this wonderful psychologist, Erich Fromm, who I quote in the conclusion of the book. He talks about how human beings spend so much of their lives trying to become free in the modern world, become individuals, become, have their own freedom of will, freedom of maneuver. And once they attain it, they get very scared by that freedom. And they start to search for something that will fill that hole. He talks about, for example, immigrants in the book who come to the United States desperate to leave the horrible, stultifying, conformist communities and religious hierarchies that they lived in, whether it was in Ireland or Italy. And when they come here, they find themselves free, but lonely, atomized, and they start searching for a return to some kind of community. And he describes in one of the paragraphs how even the mafia played that role in some way of giving people that sense. If you remember the opening scene of The Godfather, where there's this interchange between Don Corleone and this undertaker. And the undertaker says to Don Corleone, I want to pay you to beat up the people who beat up my daughter. And he says, Don Corleone says, Marlon Brando says, you're trying to have a transaction with me, like a modern individualist. I won't engage in that. You become part of my family. You become part of my circle. I'll help you, and one day I may come to you and ask you for a favor. So it was a rejection of individualized transaction and a return to community. And I think that's the part we don't know how to handle in a modern world.
I would say that the change that's going on in the United States now was addressed a bit by Barack Obama in his very famous speech in the 2004 presidential campaign, when he spoke at the Democratic National Convention, and he said, we're not a bunch of red states, we're not blue states, we're the United States. That's very good rhetoric, but probably wasn't exactly true, because we are red states and blue states now, unfortunately. So members of Congress are unable to get things done because they are from red states or blue states, and there's no compromise right now compared to what it used to be the case. Think about this. In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned roughly 40 states because he didn't know how they were going to go. Richard Nixon famously campaigned in all 50 states, probably a mistake to do that, so these candidates were campaigning across the country because they didn't know how each state was going to go. Today, there's only need to campaign in 5 states, really. The last 2 presidential elections, 45 states out of the 50 voted exactly the same. 45 states voted either Democratic or Republican consistently in 2016 and 2020. The only 5 states that shifted were Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. Those are only 5 states that shifted. Those 5 states were won by Donald Trump in 2016 and won by Joe Biden in 2020. Those are the only states right now that probably the election is to depend on. Now, there's always talk about maybe North Carolina might shift, maybe Nevada might shift, but basically those 5 states that I mentioned are the ones that really hold the key to the election, and that's in part because people are either religiously red or religiously blue, and they don't want to hear from somebody on the other side.
So, David, you've nicely brought us to the second hole, but before we get there, my pastor will not forgive me if I let Fareed equate church with the mafia as simply as you just did. So I want to note my objection to that. But the second hole that you point to is a hole of leadership. And this is what your book is about, David, is talking to political leaders who, at least under the design of the Constitution, are supposed to help lead the body politic through these kinds of turmoils. And yet there's doubt about the caliber of the leaders that are on.
You know, it's a very serious question. Why do people want to go through the ordeal of spending 2 years on the road to become president of the United States when, look what's happened to our presidents. We deified George Washington and so forth, and he was a great person. Probably today he wouldn't be deified as much because of other things. But think about this. John Kennedy's elected president of the United States, assassinated. Lyndon Johnson driven out of office. Richard Nixon had to resign. Gerald Ford not reelected. Jimmy Carter not reelected. Ronald Reagan had the Iran-Contra scandal. George Herbert Walker Bush not reelected. Bill Clinton had a scandal that almost decimated his presidency, and he was impeached. Donald Trump was impeached twice. So you have to say to yourself, why do people who have a reasonably good life want to go be president of the United States? Well, obviously, there's a human gene that says life will be more successful and you'll feel better about yourself if you are a leader. And so people like to be leaders, and the ultimate leadership position in the world is the presidency. It is amazing, though, that so many people still want that job when you look at what happened to the people who have this job. And on the other hand, you have to say, why aren't more people of extraordinary quality running? Now, George Washington, think about this. When this country had 3 million people in 1776, we had 3 million people. We had 500,000 were slaves. They couldn't be in government. 1.25 million were white women who couldn't be in government. 10,000 were Jewish. They couldn't vote or be in government. And then if you didn't have property, you couldn't be in government. So you had about 400,000 white Christian property-owning men. Out of that 400,000, you got, as candidates for president, as presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Now we have 350 million people, and we have...
I think I know where you're going.
we don't have George Washington and so forth. Why is that? Well, of course, these people weren't gods in those days. They were criticized as well, and if we had George Washington on this platform now, we'd know all the mistakes he made, and we'd talk about how he's not so great. But I do wish that we had more people of high quality who are people who have run foundations, run universities, who are scholars, or people who do things other than just be a politician, who seek the highest office in the land. But unfortunately, we don't do that right now because doing so is very difficult family-wise and other costs.
So at the end of the 19th century, a man named James Bryce, he later was ennobled, became Lord Bryce, wrote a book called The American Commonwealth. And it was a sort of Englishman's version of de Tocqueville. It was the guy who would come here and sort of try to observe what was unusual about America. And the last chapter of that book, so think about this is the 1890s, right? So it's basically, I'm sure many of you will struggle to name the American presidents after Ulysses Grant, not you, David, but most people. Millard Fillmore, Rutherford B. Hayes, these are not names that adorn many statues in the United States. And he has the last chapter, which is called "Why Are There No Great Men who run for president in America. So the question has been one for a long time, and his argument is that America is fundamentally a system built on the strength of its society, not the strength of its state. That if you're looking for people in America who are the great Americans, you will find them in business, in art, in culture, in universities, but you don't look to politics. That's not where you find them. So I do think some of it is that we are not, in a strange way, when we faced absolute existential crises, we did throw up extraordinary leaders. Think about the period, from the 30s onwards. So you have Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower. This is an extraordinary trio of people who not only rescued the country from the Great Depression, rescue the world from fascism, confront and deter Soviet communism, but also transform America in the process. It becomes a more modern, more generous, more, with a real social safety net and things like that. So the question is why we don't have it now, and I puzzle about exactly the question that David asked. I think that our political system has gotten so crazy with, in a weird way, it's too much democracy. We're the only country in the world that has this primary system. Most places, political parties choose their candidate, and then you offer them to the public for election. We go through this election before we have the election. And what that means is, since only 10% of Republicans and 10% of Democrats vote in primaries, you get, guess who votes? The fanatics, the people who are the most zealous. And guess what? These are not the moderate, centrist types. These are the people who have the most extreme views, the most passionate. And now, with social media, much of the agenda and debate is dominated by Twitter. I refuse to call it X. It's dominated by Twitter, which is 10% of the 10%. So now you've got a few thousand people sitting in their mothers' homes in pajamas, in their basements, fulminating on the keyboards, and this is, translating into driving the agenda of the greatest republic in the world. It's craziness. So why would a normal human being put himself through that gauntlet, as you say, for 2.5 years?
Well, let me just mention two people that you mentioned, and one other factor. Ulysses S. Grant, not considered a great president, but great general. But think about this. Of all the people who became president of the United States, perhaps the most unlikely. He was thrown out of the Army for being an alcoholic. And as some of you may have remembered, Abraham Lincoln's famous comment about him when later he became the general of the Army, and he was very successful. All the other generals of the Civil War weren't so successful. When Lincoln was going to appoint him to be the head general, people said, he's an alcoholic, Mr. President. He said, well, find out what kind of alcohol he's drinking and give it to the other generals as well. But Ulysses S. Grant was thrown out of the military before the Civil War for being more or less an alcoholic. He resigned because he was going to be court-martialed had he not done so. He went back to his father, tried to get a job with his father. Stannery didn't like to do it. He went to work with another part of his family, didn't work. And ultimately, he basically had a little farm. He chops up firewood, and he goes to St. Louis, near where he was living, and he's selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis in 1860 when the war broke out. And 8 years later, 1868, he's elected President of the United States. That's incredible. Eisenhower is another president that when I was growing up in the 50s, I said, boy, this is an old, old man. He's so old-looking, old, old, old. Well, I looked it up recently. How old was he when he was elected? 62. 62, a teenager today. He left office when he was 70, too young to even be president today. And then one other point, one of the reasons people don't like our system around the world is the founding fathers could never decide how to elect a president. They didn't think the people who were really smart enough to be able to figure out how to elect the right person, so they came up with this kind of bastardized compromise called the Electoral College. Why they called it the college, not the university, I don't know. Could have called it the Electoral University, but the Electoral College. And in this country, we've had 5 cases where the person who won the majority of the popular vote did not get to be president. And many people around the world say, well, what kind of democracy are you telling us we should have when your person who gets elected president is not even the majority winner? Is that a real democracy? The only time, though, that you had riots in the streets when somebody got to be elected president who wasn't really the popular winner. It was the opposite of that. Donald Trump lost the last election by 7 million votes, and interestingly, that's when there were riots in the streets, when the popular winner didn't get to be elected president. The five cases where the person with the popular winner didn't get to be president, there were no riots in the streets, and Al Gore gave an incredible speech when he walked away from the presidential campaign after losing Florida by 537 votes, a real test of statesmanship, I would say.
You interviewed these leaders, indeed. You interviewed these leaders recently, so since January 6th. Did they comment on that? Because it is an extraordinary moment in American society, and I would say that the presidents you interviewed understood that better than anyone else, right? Those are the 5 people who knew what that day meant better than anyone else.
Which day? You're talking about
January 6th, yeah. So but basically the flawed transition. Did they speak to that?
January 6th is just like the country. You have your views on it based on generally your political persuasion. If you are a big Trump supporter, you will think these people were hostages and they were just visiting the Capitol that day. And if you're not, you see it as an incredible sign of disarray. I'm just curious. There's something about the human brain that remembers tragic events and it never forgets them. So how many people here remember, who are old enough to remember where you were when John Kennedy was assassinated? Everybody? All right.
I was alive, but I don't know where I was.
How many people can remember when you heard that Osama bin Laden had been captured? Okay? And how many of you can remember exactly what you were doing on January the 6th? Right? It's amazing how the human brain etches these things into our mind, and it etches these things in because they're so unusual and they're so distinctive, and they're things that you just can't believe you're ever going to see or experience again. And in that event, January 6th has really divided the country in many ways, and I suspect that it's not impossible that something like that, not quite exactly the same, could happen again in the next election if it's very close in some ways, because we have a very close election. It's not as if we have a system where if it's a close election in a parliamentary system, sometimes you have a kind of a coalition government. But we don't have coalition government. We have the bizarre situation where in the House of Representatives, for example, the Republicans have a 2-seat majority, I think now, roughly two seats, yet they're governing as if they have a 50-seat majority. They won't compromise. It's just, if you flew in from Mars and say, how can you try to govern from the far right when you only have a 2-seat majority? People would say, well, that's the way we're trained and that's what our constituents want. It is a strange way to run a democracy, in my view.
Did the presidents you interviewed for your book, have a useful thing to say about how we can get out of this mess? Or do I have to buy the book to find out?
If nobody really has a perfect way of it. I think the large part of what's happened is money is basically allowed by the Supreme Court to be given to candidates with essentially no limits at all. So you can give whatever you want. There's no real limits. And as a result, you get people who on the far left and the far right giving staggering sums of money, particularly in Congress. Nobody gives the money to members of Congress because they say, I want you to go to Washington and be right down the middle, weigh things and make sure you make the best decision for the country. They give money because you're on the far right or the far left. And there are members of Congress now whose only thing they want to do is raise money. They have no interest in legislating. They just want to raise money and get their Instagram profile up. It's a sad situation, I think, and I think no president really has a solution for it. If I had a solution, I'd be in Iowa and New Hampshire, but actually I'm too young to be president. I'm only 74, so you need to be older.
So I think that look, let me state where I'm coming. David is right about what one's view is. I regard January 6th as a very important watershed event. It is the first time an American president tried to block the peaceful transfer of power. Forget about whether he incited the mobs outside the Capitol. I don't care. What was much more important was he did pressure his own vice president and a majority of House Republicans who then agreed to vote against certifying the election of Joe Biden, even though it had been authorized and certified by 50 states and D.C., even though he had challenged it in 56 court cases, all of which he lost. Despite that, a majority of House Republicans voted against the certification of that election. That strikes me as a huge deal. Now, my hope is that what Trump may represent is partly the kind of things I'm describing in this book, the wave of populism, cultural backlash that is coursing through much of Western world and even beyond the West in places like Turkey and Brazil. But some of it is a personality cult. You know, look at the last Republican primary. For the first time in its history, the Republican Party had no platform. The party platform was one paragraph that literally said, whatever Donald Trump says is what the Republican Party stands for. And if he changes his mind tomorrow, we change our minds too. The convention did not invite a single living Republican president or presidential nominee, but it did have 5 speaking slots in prime time for members of the Trump family. That's more like a family cult than a political party, which makes me think, you know, maybe, I mean, I don't think he can live forever. I don't think. And we'll see, you know, I mean, I think that this might be, this particular piece of it might be a phase. We'll still have to deal with populism and cultural backlashes and all that, but the weirdness of Donald Trump may be a phase.
Okay, we're pretty soon going to move to audience Q&A, and there'll be mic runners that will help with that. But before we go there, I want to ask one other question having to do with higher education, because both of you have experience on boards, so you know what it's like to see the university from an enterprise level. The universities are one of the crowning achievements of the West that Fareed describes. And in the United States, they're have been some of our best brand, but there's a perception that they're in crisis, and that crisis has intensified after 10/7, after the horrible attacks and the aftermath. And you've seen university presidents be hounded out and boards being put under pressure. So my question to both of you is, what is your perspective on this apparent crisis in higher education, and what advice would you give?
I think I've spent more time on university boards than virtually anybody in this country. I've spent 12 years on the Duke board, 12 years on the Chicago board. I now chair the University of Chicago board. I chaired the Duke board. I spent 6 years on the Harvard board and 12 years on the Hopkins board. So about 50 years on university boards.
Thank you for your service.
And the compensation is very high, so that's why I did it. Look, the universities are the crown jewel of our society in many ways, because people from all over the world want to come here and get an American education. People really think that our great universities are the places that they can get educated and advance themselves, and that's why people are so anxious to come here. And I think the universities are not perfect, no organization's perfect, but I think universities are quite not respected as much in Washington, D.C., for example. There's an endowment tax that was put in in spite of universities because they were thought they'd be too liberal. We've seen the recent turmoil at some universities because of things that happened in Congress, and the universities have their imperfections for sure. But think about this. Where else would you rather go to get educated? There's some great universities, obviously, in other parts of the world, but no place has as many great universities as the United States does. And I think they're not perfect institutions, and we have some crises for sure, but I really still think that one of the greatest things this country has done is build the university system that really educates large numbers of our population, though sadly, more than a majority of Americans or adults do not have a college degree. We have to remember that. So it's not a majority even have a college degree. But those people that are fortunate, like me, to come from modest circumstances and get a college degree, you have a chance of really going somewhere in life. And I think the university system enables that to happen in a way that maybe not other countries do. In other words, here, almost anybody can get a college education if they really want one, and get a very good one if they really work hard in getting it. And I think that's one of the reasons why our education system, while it's criticized, is still the envy of the world. And the crises we have in universities, they're significant, but I don't think they're going to destroy the universities. The only thing that's going to destroy the universities is people in Capitol Hill trying to do something that destroys them, but I think it's a temporary kind of thing. And in the end, these universities are going to survive most members of Congress.
I think David described very well the glories of universities, and I similarly, I came to Yale on a scholarship, then got a scholarship for graduate school. But to ask yourself the question of why is it that people are willing to spend so much money, invest so much from all over the world to come to the best universities to get the best education? It really is part of this whole Enlightenment project of saying you are important as an individual, and if you invest, if you gain knowledge, knowledge is the ultimate asset you can have. It's not bloodlines, it's not birth, it's not what religion you are, it's not what race you are. If you can invest in knowledge and build that up inside of you, you will succeed in life. That is, to my mind, the ultimate break with human history, the ultimate symbol of the rise of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinking. But I think that universities in some ways have gone astray, and this happens often with liberalism, and I mean liberalism broadly construed, meaning this kind of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, all that, which is that, motivated for very good reasons, it has tried to address problems of people being excluded, all these kinds of issues where people were not equally represented or not fairly represented. But the result has been that I think universities have lost their focus on excellence and education, have spent a little bit too much time worrying about solving every social problem in the world, and in doing that, they tie themselves up into knots. So what happened in this last go-around with those 3 university presidents was a perfect example. The 3 university presidents in those hearings that I'm sure you all heard actually said the right thing, which is universities stand for free speech, and people have to be allowed to speak freely their political views, even if their views are repugnant or offensive to others. The whole point of going to universities is to confront views you disagree with, you find offensive. And we live in a society where that kind of diversity of views has always been tolerated. I mean, the court ruled that the Nazis were allowed to march in Skokie, Illinois. The mistake was, for the last 20 years, universities have been busy branding all kinds of speech as verboten, as hate speech, as bad speech, as problematic speech, as complicated speech. And so what you saw was the hypocrisy. For 20 years, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, people were saying, well, this speech is not allowed because it's anti-black, it's anti-his. But then when somebody said something that was anti-Zionist, perhaps even anti-Semitic, the university suddenly said, well, that's free speech. And you can't have it both ways. If you believe in liberalism, you have to be fair. You have to have the same standards for everyone. And I think that, maybe it's a wake-up call for all of us. If you want to preserve this project that I talk about in the book, you have to apply the same standards for everybody. And you have to the goal has to be that we move people to be seen as individuals, not as members of groups. I, came to this country with brown skin and a funny name, and I'm raised Muslim. I have never checked one of those boxes that asks me what race I am, except on the census, because I think that I understand the reason for it. Because I've never wanted to be thought of as a box, as a member of some category. I want to be thought of as myself. I want to be judged as myself. And I think that while it's important to address historic injustice, and I'm not opposed to that at all, it is important to remember the goal. The goal is that we are all thought of as individuals. The goal is that, and we should be trying to do more on that front. I'll give you an example, finally, when I was at Yale, but advice of mine that was not taken. You have these campus uprisings, and of course, immediately you get one group and another group saying, we want more money. We want more because we've been excluded, we've been marginalized. And of course, the university's approaches give them all more money and keep them quiet. I said, how about creating a fund to integrate the campus rather than to disintegrate it? Because the more money you give to every one of these groups, ethnic, racial, religious, whatever it is, gender, each one goes into their ghettos. But isn't the point that we actually want them to see what they have in common as human beings, as Yale students, as young people, whatever it is. But the emphasis so much now is to reinforce your separateness. And I just don't think that that's the best way forward in the long run.
Yeah, let me just add that there's no lack of different subject matters you can take at any great university. There's any subject you want, there's a course in it. And the university has done a wonderful job of having every piece of human knowledge something you can learn. What I want universities to do more of is to teach people who go through these schools 3 basic skills that I feel they don't often have anymore. It says a love of reading. Something like 50% of the people that have college degrees do not read a book in the next 5 years if they graduate. And people stop reading, or they read Twitter or X or whatever it's called. They don't read books, and books focus the brain in a way that no other kind of reading material does. I wish people would learn the love of reading books at universities, and that is taught, as much as anything else, any subject matter. Secondly, learning how to write. I see so many people I interview for jobs that really can't write very well. They write in a Twitter form, or they think writing a Twitter message is the same as writing a paragraph or a paper. I'm just surprised how many people don't really learn how to write. And then orally communicating. Very few people take courses on how to communicate orally. But you think about life. Life is really about persuading somebody to do what you want them to do. Your partner, your spouse, your teacher, you want people to do what you want. And people don't really learn that skill as much as I wish they would. Because if you want to be effective in life, you have to convince people by writing something well, talking well, or by leading by example. And I think that's the skill set I wish universities would teach more, how to be an effective citizen, to be able to read, write, and communicate effectively and lead as an example. That's what the skill set that I hope universities would provide more of.
So this is the second time I have to rebut Fareed because he said not to give more money. I want to emphasize American Grant Strategy Program will accept more money. And because we're emphasizing the core values that you just described, reading, writing, and communicating, and cognitive empathy, standing in the shoes of others. I'm now trying to find the shoes of Grace Endred and Jake. I can't see you out there, but I know you have the mic. So there's Jake. Where's Grace? Great. Okay, Grace, you've got the first question, and then, Jake, you look for someone to get the second question.
All right. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. So my question, you've both spoken extensively about the end of American hegemony and the rise of the rest. So given this new paradigm, do you think America should continue to aspire to unipolarity? Or, if not, do you think it's possible for the country to accept no longer enjoying a hegemonic position on the global stage?
That's for you, Fareed, I'm sure. Yes.
Look, it's a question of aspiring to unipolarity is in some ways impossible because, as I say, it's not really about American power. The U.S. is still the absolute dominant power economically in the world, the absolute dominant power militarily in the world. The point is that, you know, you live in a very different world. It's not just that China is a vast economic power with very different views, that Russia is contesting American power. It's the whole world is in a kind of different place where you're not going to be able to run the world the way that people, first of all, we never had it as easy as people think, but you're certainly in a different world today. So the real challenge becomes, is there a way to keep the world that the United States has been able to create along with its allies? Because it is, in my opinion, it has been a more stable, more peaceful world than the ones that preceded it. The last 75 years have been no picnic, particularly if you lived in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos or Syria. But in the scope of human history, the fact that you did not have a world war among the great powers of the world, the richest countries of the world, which were routine before 1945. France and Germany went to war 3 times in the 100 years before 1945, twice dragging the whole world in with them. That world that John Lewis Gaddis, the historian, calls the long peace, the rise in prosperity, the so-called global south used to be 5% of the global economy 35 years ago. Today it's 45% of the global economy. That statistic means hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in that process. So is there a way to stabilize that world? Is there a way to maintain a liberal, orderly international world with rules and openness without a liberal superpower, without a liberal hegemon upholding it? That is the great geopolitical experiment we are going to run for the next 25 years, that you are all going to watch. My own hope is that what we are able to do is to build a coalition of like-minded countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, Singapore, maybe India, that collectively is actually far more powerful than the United States ever was. The group of countries I just described is 70% of global GDP. It's 80% of global military spending. It's 95% of global agenda-setting capacity. But we have to recognize that this world is fragile. It needs to be bolstered. You have to work together. The Europeans have to get their act together and act in a more unified and cohesive way. In a way, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is a test run. It's a test case for this. Can we stay together? Can we keep the pressure? Putin is hoping that he can outlast us. And this has been the long, fond hope of every autocratic aggressor, that democracies are short-term oriented, they are not able to sustain themselves. I don't believe that. We stayed true to our allies for 45 years in the Cold War. We still have troops on the banks of the Rhine. We still have troops in South Korea. We still have troops in Japan, in Okinawa, defending those countries against deterring external foes. So I think there's reasons to be optimistic, but it's going to be a real challenge and a fascinating experiment for students of all this.
Let's go here. Jake, do you have a question there?
David, I'm Sylvia Cash, and I worked with Bruce Rosenblum for many, many years. When Carlyle was first formed, I was privileged to go with your team and Bruce on many, many occasions to New York City and type all of those massive documents for Carlyle's acquisitions. My question for you, and it's so great to see you again, and to thank you for all you have done for Duke, is who do you think was our greatest president and why? And also, do you have any insight into what North Carolina might do in November?
And who will North Carolina be? Who's the greatest president? Who will North Carolina be?
In my view, the greatest president of the United States, without doubt, is Abraham Lincoln, because he kept the country together. He was elected, and even before he was sworn in, the southern states, many of them seceded, and he had to kind of hold the country together. The tempting thing to do would be to say, okay, the South, you want to secede? Go ahead. I'm going to have my country in the North, and I don't want to, hold the country together. That was a very bold move to try to hold the country together, and then ultimately, to win the war, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially began the end of slavery. It didn't actually end until the 13th Amendment, you could argue. But I think he was our greatest president for sure, and Washington's not far behind, but Lincoln was our greatest president, I'd say. In terms of North Carolina?
North Carolina is going to vote for?
If I knew, I don't really know. I think it's going to be very close one way or the other. But I think North Carolina, with Nevada, are probably the two of the states that political pros are not certain of how it will go. Clearly, North Carolina's voted Republican last couple of elections, but it's just unclear. I do know that the faculty at Duke University and the student body at Duke University probably will be different than the votes of the rest of North Carolina. That'd be my guess.
I think that's a safe bet. I think we have time for one last question. I believe the mic is there. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This was a really illuminating discussion. My question is about the moderate discourse in America. So I increasingly worry about the extensive polarization. Y'all commented on how funding is being given extensively to politicians very left and very right, and how the primaries have a tendency to elect people more on the left and right side of the spectrums, or put people up for office. So how do you think funding in primaries is contributing to the fall of moderate discourse? And is there any way we can elect more moderate people in the future that can kind of bring America together?
It's a tough one because the structure of American politics is so set now, and the primaries are so set, it's difficult to imagine unwinding. But I give you one example. You know, it's a very unfashionable position to hold, but I am advocating in the primary process less democracy rather than more, because I think that if you look at the easiest way to discredit the old system is to talk of it as, you know, candidates were selected in smoke-filled rooms. There's nothing worse, apparently, than a smoke-filled room. But who was in those smoke-filled rooms? It tended to be mayors, aldermen, governors, senators, congressmen. In other words, people who were elected by the people and were elected in general elections. So they understood what a mainstream voter was looking for. Now, how do we choose them? We've abandoned the smoke-filled rooms, so it's the crazies. It's the fanatics. It's the people who are on Twitter all day. It's the people who send 20 emails to their congressman every week. Those are the people who go out and vote in primaries. And so, is there some way to counteract that? Well, I think that the Democratic Party, has tried to do a little bit of balancing by creating these things called superdelegates. That is what largely blocked Bernie Sanders from becoming the Democratic nominee, which I regard as being beneficial, because whatever your views on Bernie Sanders are, he was not going to get elected president. That would be the easiest way to elect a Republican as president, to elect somebody that far left. And it's just a question of understanding the country we live in. There are 340 million people. They don't all think like you. You are trying to pick the person closest to your views who has the best chance of being elected. So I would argue now, by the way, the Bernie Sanders campaign got rid of some of those superdelegate laws, so the next time around, I don't think there will be that ballast is not as strong. On your second point about money, unfortunately, I think David put it very well. We are the only country in the world that believes that money is speech. We are the only country in the world that has essentially no limits on what campaign contributions can be. It's craziness. You know, the entire British election, and the last time I checked, Britain was a healthy, functioning democracy. The entire British election costs less than a Midwestern Senate seat today. You know, I mean, and it's very hard to unwind that, because the fundamental decision is a Supreme Court decision called Buckley-Vallejo, which says money is speech. If you believe that, if you believe that there's no difference between somebody giving $1 billion to a super PAC and somebody writing an op-ed, first of all, it seems to me you need your head examined. But secondly, if you make that connection, it's very hard to regulate. Ultimately, you're just putting your finger in dikes, and no other country in the world has that belief. Every other country believes that there is a fundamental difference between money and speech.
Let me just add a final comment, if I could, to that and what Fareed has said. One of the things we haven't talked about tonight is one of the things that has made this country great is immigration. We've had the concept of the so-called American dream, the belief that anybody can rise up by their hard work and get to the top. And we've seen that throughout our country's history. But among the people who believe in the American dream more than anybody else are immigrants who come to this country. We have 50 million immigrants in this country. 50 million. No other country in the world has anything close to that many. And that's because we have an opportunity here for people to rise atop based on their ability. So if we're going to change the Constitution in any way, other than maybe changing the Electoral College, I would change the provision that says immigrants cannot be elected president, because I'd like someone like Fareed to be able to run for president.
You and my mom.
One of the purposes of tonight was to celebrate Duke, 100 years, probably formed in a smoke-filled room, I'm guessing, back in the day. But Duke has come a long way and has cherished the values that were on display tonight. And I want to thank you both for what you've done for Duke and for the way you embody the values that we celebrate here. And for that, we're very much in your debt. We're especially in your debt, but we're also in your debt, Fareed, for all of that. And so please join me in thanking.
city.